What's going on there, guys? Welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be talking about The Lord of the Rings Third Age and why it is my top candidate for a Lord of the Rings game from the early 2000s era that genuinely could use a remake for if we are to do any remakes for the Lord of the Rings games from that era. So the big thing that I really look at when I'm trying to think of what games I want to be remade, I look at a lot of different things, but the biggest thing with the Third Age that I really look at is its story. There are a lot of things within the story of the Third Age that I do genuinely really enjoy, but there's also a lot of things that I think could be redone and rehashed. Now, gameplay-wise, I'm not going to go too much into it because I do genuinely really enjoy the gameplay from the Third Age. I think it has a lot of really cool mechanics. I think the turn-based was a great way to introduce people to turn-based mechanics, and since it takes a lot of inspiration and honestly just kind of rips a lot of stuff from Final Fantasy X, I genuinely think that if you have never played a turn-based RPG before, the Third Age is a great one to jump into because it's really simple to understand, it makes a ton of sense, and it's honestly just a lot of fun. However, when I look at the story, there are a lot of things within the story that leave a lot to be desired. So if you haven't played the game before, I am just going to let you know there are going to be some spoilers, but also it's been like 20 years, and if you don't know this game and you haven't played it before, I don't know what else to tell you. It's just kind of how it is. Alright, so in the Third Age, you were introduced to Barethor, a captain of the Citadel Guard of Gondor who is on a quest to find Boromir. Upon his quest, he meets multiple different people: Idriel of Lothlorien, Elagast of the Dunedain, Hadhad of Erebor, Morwen of Rohan, and Eowyn of Rohan. Throughout his journey, he uncovers this crazy plot where it ends up being found out that he has been under the influence of Saruman the White, who was using him to try and locate Boromir so that way he could get the Ring of Power for himself. Barethor then has to go through some additional trauma when he learns that he was under the influence of Nazgul from a Morgul blade that was lodged into his shoulder during the Battle of Osgiliath that prevented him from being able to hurt any of the Nazgul. And the plotline where that comes in is actually really cool because you learn that Barethor actually deserts from the original battle of Osgiliath way back during the time before the Fellowship of the Ring, when Boromir is leaving to go to Rivendell and be a part of the Council of Elrond. And you learn that he deserts because of the wound that he gets from the Morgul blade and ends up getting banished and exiled from Gondor, and then from there he then gets put under the influence of Saruman. And so he has this intense reconciliation and redemption from his past, which is a really cool moment because I really just think it was a great story of redemption and just a cool way to see how he follows through the events of the Fellowship with the guidance of Gandalf to face his past and inevitably come out to be stronger. However, that's about the extent of the plot. Once you finish up that plotline in Osgiliath, it's pretty much just, we're just going to now throw you into all of the events of the rest of the Return of the King, and that's going to be about it. They don't really do a ton of developing on the rest of the characters. Idriel has her character development where she ends up falling in love with Barethor, but then has to deal with the fact that Barethor is destined for another person, which is Morwen, and that's a whole obnoxious love triangle plotline that genuinely takes away from so much of the main storyline because you get so wrapped up in the drama between the three of them, where Barethor meets Morwen and immediately he's like encapsulated by her despite openly being in a relationship with Idriel that started at the end of Moria. It was just such an obnoxious plotline that I genuinely really think that if they were to go that route of wanting a love triangle, they really needed to flesh it out a little bit more. It genuinely just was a huge distraction from the majority of the story, and I really think that's a big area that does need to be reconciled and rehashed out in a way that would flow a lot better into the events that go on throughout the rest of the game. Another thing that I really would like to see remade is throughout the game, there are a lot of moments where you can collect these epic scenes from Middle-earth, in which then you will see some various scenes from the movie that Gandalf kind of narrates, giving some exposition to events that are going on in the movie, maybe introducing some of the movie characters, and just kind of keeping you tied in with the plot of what was going on. Now, Since this game came out around the same time as Peter Jackson's movies, the developing team that was working alongside New Line Cinema still needed to try and capitalize on the success of Peter Jackson's movies, and so the choices that they make here are totally understandable from a business standpoint because they really want to capitalize on the situation that they were in. They wanted to make sure that everything was remaining very closely tied in with the world that Peter Jackson had created through the movies, but it also was one of those things where Gandalf just kind of turned into this Deus Machina type character, where he inserted himself in areas where it made a lot of sense for him to be there, just to help Barethor along and kind of save him in the areas that were kind of the most convenient. And then it really took away a lot of the agency that Barethor would have as an individual character. And there are a lot of moments where Barethor loses his own moments that could have been a really cool self moment, but instead became a moment that was, oh, he couldn't have done this without Gandalf intervening. Even though Gandalf should have been a lot more prioritized over everything going on with the ring and everything else going on, he still was able to use some of his power to help Barethor. It just kind of doesn't really make sense. And so I would really like to see that part of the story kind of hashed out a little bit differently. I think there are moments like in East Emnet Gullies when Gandalf shows up where that's totally okay, because that helps to kind of guide the party on their quest after Boromir dies. It helps them to kind of keep the plot moving forward, and Gandalf kind of continuing to keep them moving towards the rest of the major events that happen in Middle-earth. However, I really just think that Gandalf was kind of overused as like a shepherd and like a savior for Barethor, when he really just didn't necessarily need it, and could have had those moments where he could have overcome things either by himself or with the intervening of the rest of his party. You know, Idril could have been a lot better of an influence in his breaking of Saruman, or just the friendships that he had made to be a cool way to break the influence of evil, as just another building off of the theme of fellowship, and that it's not necessarily about these grander powers of Maya such as Gandalf, but rather the small things like the friendships you build along the way that really help to break the forces of evil and different things like that. I don't know, I'm just kind of pulling things out of my butt on that one. So that's kind of my thought with Gandalf there. The final thing I really want to talk about is the other three members of the cast that are put into the game that you don't really see too much of after very specific moments. So first off is Elagast and Hadhod. Elagast is a ranger of the Dunedain that is a friend of Hadhod the dwarf. And he is somebody that is looking for Hadhod because they were encountering a map to Moria. Exactly why they were trying to go to Moria, I don't remember off the top of my head. I'm pretty sure Hadhod just wanted to find Moria and figure out what was going on, because of the rumors of the fall of Moria and all of that fun stuff. And so that was something that was a really cool plotline to kind of see the two of them as they become friends, and them going into Moria together, and then Hadhod dealing with the grief of seeing his people completely wiped out. But then they leave Moria, and you don't get like anything else from them. They get like one or two scenes here and there, but for the most part they are just completely thrown to the wayside. I think Moria is such a cool moment between all of those characters, but then you get out of Moria and that's the end of it. And I really would like to see how they get fleshed out. I want to see Hadhod's motivation for continuing to journey with the party, for continuing to be a part of these major events in Middle-earth. I want to see Elagast's motivation, whether it's because he knows that Aragorn, his chieftain, is doing this incredible quest. He might not know, he might, I don't know. That's something that you just genuinely don't get to see throughout the game, and that's something that I really want to see fleshed out more. And I think remaking the game would be a way that you could really flesh out these characters and give them a lot more of a stronger presence, a stronger story, and something that could really give them a much better use than just being there after the events of Moria and after the fight with the Balrog. And then there's Eowyn. He is a member of the Rohirrim. He shows up at the end of the Rohan chapter, and he is literally just there. He doesn't really have any major plot points whatsoever outside of just kind of rubbing salt in Barithor's wounds in Osgiliath. He really doesn't do much. He has a lot of really cool abilities, and I think mechanically he's probably the most fun character to use out of everybody. However, he just doesn't really have any overarching contribution to the plot. I think that he had a lot of just really underwhelming presence as a player, and I think that he really could have been utilized better, especially once the Battle of Helm's Deep was over. He had no reason to still be with the party. He was a member of the Rohirrim. He shouldn't have been leaving his king. He shouldn't have been leaving Rohan to stay with them, but yet he just does. It's kind of one of those things that just really bug me about the story, is they really just take these characters that could have been really, really well done and don't really do anything to flesh them out, and they really just don't prioritize these characters, but rather once you get through that later half and you start getting into the events of the Return of the King, they just focus really on that fan service and really trying to just keep the members of this party involved in the grander events of the War of the Ring rather than continuing to flesh out their story. And that just is something that I just really wanted to see more of, and I think in a remake is something that we could see more fleshed out in a better way, and I would really like to see more of that from these characters, because I genuinely think there's a lot of really cool potential with these characters. They just haven't had the opportunities to be fleshed out in a good way. And the last thing that we're going to talk about here is the final boss of the game, because this is my biggest issue. I'm fine with the fight with the Balrog. That's really cool fan service, it's kind of whatever. But the final boss, it drives me up a wall. You fight the Witch King of Angmar with Éowyn. Morwen gets injured. Aragorn comes over and heals them. He talks about his plan to go and march on the Black Gate, and you're like, aw, snap, we're going to do this big gauntlet of enemies in the Black Gate. And then, for some reason, you just get yeeted up on top of Barad-dûr, and you're supposed to fight the Eye of Sauron? Like, what? This is something that genuinely makes me crash out so much over this, because this game has such a cool opportunity to really kind of make you feel that you were in this hopeless battle. Maybe you had to survive a certain amount of turns with a lot of different enemies. I don't know exactly how they would have played that out, but instead you were just thrown to this weird, crazy boss fight, and they're basically just kind of like having this moment where they have to be like, oh yeah, we have to remember we're now a Lord of the Rings Final Fantasy game or something like that, where they just kind of throw you into this crazy boss fight at the end of most Final Fantasy games. And it's just, the Third Age is kind of is doing that same thing. And it's like, here's your crazy boss fight. You have to fight the Eye of Sauron now. And then that fight ends, and there's just a narration by Gandalf. You don't get to know what happens to any of the characters. They don't get any resolution whatsoever. It's just sort of like, okay, the game's over, Gandalf's gonna narrate, and that's gonna be the end of it. Credits are gonna roll. It genuinely has such wasted potential, and I really think that this game could be so much better if it were remade today. I don't expect a remake to honestly happen, because I think a remake of this game is just not very likely due to licensing and stuff like that. I'm not going to go into that. I have a whole other video about that. I'll have that link down in the description below. But I seriously want to see The Lord of the Rings: The Third Age to be remade with modern graphics, maybe some modernized mechanics, whether it's taking some of the turn-based mechanics and improving upon them, or even turning it into an action-based game. I don't care either way, however they handle it. Does not matter to me. I actually really like the mechanics of the game, so I'm not too worried about that. All I really want to see is just the story to be fleshed out in a way that genuinely would make the game feel so much better, would provide a really, really cool original story with new characters that follows along the plot of the movie without directly influencing it. And that's what the Third Age does. It follows along the plot, but does have too many moments where it directly changes things. And so I really just would like to see that. Let me know your guys' thoughts down in the comments below. Do you want to see this game remade at all? I personally, again, like I had said, this is at the top of my list, so let me know what you guys think. And as always, I do want to give a huge shout out to all my Ko-Fi supporters. You guys are the ones that help to make this channel possible. If you would like to financially support the channel, this is the best way to do so. There's a link to do that down in the description below. Also join my Discord. I am taking any and all suggestions for new videos. If there's any sort of video essays or anything like that that you want to see, you can join the Discord and put that in the suggestions part of the Discord. And also just come hang out. It's a fun place to be. But that will do it for this video. As always, you are loved, you are valued, you are fearfully and wonderfully made, and we will see you right back here in the next one. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everybody.